They yanked her out of first class like she didn't belong there, like her dark skin was some kind of violation against the leather seats and linen napkins. No eye contact, no explanation, just a stiff-lipped flight attendant barking about a seat reassignment, while a white man slid into her place like he'd been there all along. Passengers stared but said nothing. Some smirked. One laughed. She was forced to march back to coach, past rows of silent witnesses, her coat clutched in one hand, her pride bleeding out with every step. No one asked her name. No one cared. To them, she was just another mistake that needed fixing, a body in the wrong place at the wrong time. What they didn't know was that the woman they just humiliated publicly, purposefully, held the kind of power that doesn't scream but dismantles. This isn't just a story about racism. It's a reckoning. Like if that hit you. Subscribe if you want to see what happens when silence turns into strategy. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And have you ever seen injustice that quiet? It's time. Linnell Greer moved through the bustling terminal of Atlanta International with the quiet poise of someone long accustomed to airports, though her expression held the weariness of someone who'd seen too many of them for all the wrong reasons. She walked with her shoulders relaxed, not slouched, her steps deliberate, but unhurried. Her gray coat was neatly buttoned up, scarf tucked precisely beneath the collar. Her travel bag, scuffed at the edges but polished clean, hung from her right shoulder, bouncing lightly against her hip. At a glance, she looked like any high-level consultant heading out on yet another long-haul business flight. But she knew better than most how little that mattered when people didn't want to see her, especially people in uniforms. When Linnell reached the first-class gate for Skylux Flight 701 to Geneva, the line was short. She stood behind an older couple dressed in crisp linen, their voices low and confident. The boarding screen flashed her group number, Priority 1, and she approached when it was called. Her boarding pass, a digital copy on her phone and a printed version in her coat, was ready. She handed the printout to the flight attendant at the gate, a tall woman with blonde hair pulled into a taut chignon. Her name tag read Diane Kelton. Diane took the paper, eyes flicking from the name to the seat number to the woman holding it. Her lips tightened. Not quite a frown, but something colder. Her gaze dropped briefly to Linnell's shoes, then to her scarf, then lingered, just a moment too long, on her face. "One moment," she said, voice clipped. Diane turned toward the terminal wall-mounted screen and tapped at her tablet. Behind Linnell, the next passengers waited, hesitant. She turned slightly to let them by, assuming Diane's pause was procedural. The attendant, however, did not waver through. Instead, she tapped again, frowned theatrically, and said, "Huh." Linnell kept still. "Problem?" she asked softly. Diane looked back, keeping her voice neutral, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You're booked in 1A?" "Yes," Linnell answered. "That's correct." Diane's fingers hovered over the tablet for another beat before she nodded, slowly, as if digesting something unfortunate. "It's just that seat has been reassigned." A beat of silence passed between them. "Reassigned?" Linnell asked. Her voice remained even, neither confused nor confrontational. She had learned long ago that tone could be used against her. "Yes," Diane said, with the practiced attachment of someone who had already decided what the conversation's outcome would be. Sometimes the system updates the configuration after final load checks. It's rare, but it happens. Her eyes didn't leave Linnell's. "You'll be in 23D now." Linnell knew exactly where 23D was, toward the rear of the aircraft, near the lavatories. An aisle seat in economy. "There must be a mistake," she said. Still calm. Still professional. "I booked and paid for seat 1A 6 weeks ago." Diane smiled in that cold, distant way that people do when they want you to stop talking. "Please step aside, ma'am. We need to finish boarding." She didn't ask for identification. She didn't recheck the manifest. She didn't explain why someone else was now sitting in 1A, why Linnell's booking wasn't honored, or why she hadn't been informed of this so-called reassignment earlier. She simply gestured toward the jet bridge with a soft flick of the hand. Linnell did not argue. She stepped aside. Her breathing remained steady, but her eyes had narrowed almost imperceptibly. As the next passengers boarded, a tall man in a gray suit moved ahead and handed over his ticket with a smile. Diane greeted him warmly, her tone different. He chuckled at something she said, and she laughed a little too loudly. Linnell said nothing. When she finally stepped onto the plane, the first-class cabin was half full. A man in her seat, 1A, was already reclining. She recognized him. He had been directly behind her at the gate. Tall, trim, white, wearing an expensive watch and polished shoes. He looked settled, comfortable, as if he had always belonged there. Linnell walked past. He didn't meet her eyes. The woman beside him adjusted her seatbelt and clutched her handbag closer. Linnell reached the cramped quarters of row 23, where the lighting was harsher and the scent of overused air vent stronger. 23D was a tight aisle seat. The window passenger was already seated, legs sprawled. Linnell stored her bag in the overhead compartment, which required shifting several backpacks and a duffel bag to make room. Her carry-on fit barely. She sat down, folded her hands, and exhaled. No one looked at her. Not directly. But she could feel the tension. Her presence had disrupted a rhythm. Her seat back didn't recline. Her tray table clicked unevenly. The air vent above her blew cold air in sharp bursts. Behind her, the lavatory door opened and shut every few minutes. A baby cried nearby. The overhead lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft reached cruising altitude, casting long shadows across the rows. She kept her hands folded in her lap, fingers clasped so tightly the knuckles whitened. Yet her expression stayed composed, controlled, unreadable. She had practiced that look for years, the one that revealed nothing and allowed nothing in. It wasn't the first time she had been pushed aside, made smaller to accommodate the insecurities of others. But the insult today had been sharpened by how precisely it had been executed. The calculated nature of it echoed in her ears louder than the engines ever could. The reassignment hadn't been a system glitch or logistical necessity. It had been a decision, dressed in protocol, executed without hesitation, and made permanent by silence. As if to prove the point, a flight attendant approached her row with a tray of drinks. The man beside her, now snoring softly with a blanket drawn up to his chin, was bypassed. She was offered a single plastic cup half filled with lukewarm water. No ice, no napkin. The tray moved on. Linnell accepted it with a nod she didn't mean, placed the cup in the narrow groove of the armrest, and continued staring straight ahead. Minutes passed. Then more. The cabin settled. Cabin lights dimmed further, a signal for passengers to prepare for rest. But rest was a foreign idea to her now. Her mind circled back, again and again, to the interaction at the gate, the smirk on Diane's face, the man in 1A lounging in the seat she paid for, the way the situation had unfolded so smoothly, like it had been practiced. She noticed how no one had questioned it, not the passengers around her, not the second flight attendant who had watched from the galley, not the boarding agent who had stood 10 feet away. It was as though the entire system had shifted around her in perfect, indifferent choreography. A few rows ahead, a soft beep rang out from a call button. A male passenger requested help with his armrest. A second passenger complained about the screen freezing. Both were addressed promptly. Linnell remained seated in silence. The call button above her head stared back like an eye she refused to blink at. She knew how that story played out. Then came the announcement. Diane's voice crackled through the speakers again, sharp and clear despite the low murmur of the cabin. She reminded first-class passengers of their wine pairings and upcoming dessert options, casually referencing names and orders with practiced charm. Linnell's name was never spoken. At 33,000 feet, the distance between rows 1 and 23 stretched longer than any runway. She thought briefly of speaking up, of standing, returning to the front, confronting Diane, demanding an explanation, retrieving the ticket from her bag, proving her seat belonged to her. But another voice, a familiar one, quieter, deeper, echoed inside her. Don't escalate. Don't challenge. Don't become the problem. It had been said to her before by colleagues, by mentors, even by family. Don't give them a reason. Don't let them twist it. So she didn't. Instead, She remained in her narrow seat as the cart rolled by again, this time with meals. A foil-covered tray was dropped onto her fold-out table, without a word. The attendant did not ask about allergies, preferences, or dietary needs. The tray contained a congealed pasta, wilted vegetables, and a dry biscuit sealed in brittle plastic. The man beside her stirred, sniffed once, then rolled away from her and resumed snoring. She removed the foil, stared at the contents, and let the smell dissipate into the cabin air. Behind her, the restroom light flicked on. Someone flushed. Ahead of her, the curtain separating first class swayed gently with movement. It parted briefly, just long enough for her to see Diane lean down and laugh at something a seated passenger said. Linnell recognized the profile of the man now holding a wine glass in 1A. He had removed his jacket and was laughing, relaxed, tapping on a tablet. Her tablet. She could see the corner of the leather case. It had been handed to the attendants during boarding, so she wouldn't have to struggle with it in her cramped row. She hadn't seen it since. Her name was engraved on the spine. She sat straighter. Her heart ticked faster. Had they not returned it? Or had he taken it? Was that part of the reassignment? She stood halfway, intending to press the call button, to inquire, to ask. But just as her hand reached up, the man turned his head, made eye contact with her through the small slit between curtain and wall, and smiled. Not warmly, not nervously, with smug satisfaction. Then the curtain closed again. Linnell lowered her hand. She sat down slowly, not because she had changed her mind, but because the answer had already been given. There would be no correction, no return. Her property, her seat, her voice, all reassigned. Permanently. The injustice wasn't loud. It wasn't shouted or written or even acknowledged. It was quiet, almost elegant, woven into the flight like turbulence hidden beneath a calm sky. Around her, the passengers had begun their descent into restless slumber or distracted screen staring, a collective acceptance of a long night ahead. Her fingers, though, curled against the edges of her coat as if gripping the last shred of warmth that hadn't already been stripped from her dignity. The overhead lights dimmed further, casting a pale blue glow that washed over the cabin and deepened the shadows along the walls and under the seats. In that light, everyone blurred together, indistinct in their isolation, everyone but her. She remained carved in sharp relief, not because of anything she did, but because of everything that had been done to her, and everything still to come. From the galley, behind her came the low clatter of trays being sorted and locked away. The voice of a flight attendant whispered instructions to a colleague, hushed tones not meant to carry, but the cabin was too quiet, and the words slipped through the thin veil of air. Someone said her row number. The phrase uncooperative demeanor drifted past her ears. It wasn't said directly, but it reached her anyway. Her jaw clenched, her lips pressed together, and still she did not turn around. She did not flinch. She did not confirm what she already knew. She was being spoken about, dissected without permission, her silence rebranded as resistance, her stillness painted as defiance. The narrative shifted without her input, and no one would question it. That was the trick of it. You didn't have to make a scene to be called difficult. You only had to exist where you weren't expected to. Then came the laughter. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even aimed directly at her. But it cut all the same. 2 rows behind her and across the aisle, a pair of young men, maybe mid-20s, maybe just old enough to afford the illusion of professionalism, shared something on a phone. Their heads leaned in close, shoulders shaking in the way of people trying not to laugh, but wanting others to notice. One of them tilted the screen just enough for a brief image to flicker past Linnell's peripheral vision. A stock photo of a flight attendant and a seated passenger, edited crudely with oversized glasses and exaggerated features. Someone had drawn a cartoonish scarf over the image, just like the one she wore, a smear of brown marker scribbled over the skin. The other man laughed harder, biting his knuckle as if to stifle it, but the shaking of his frame gave him away. They looked her way once, just briefly, then looked back down with feigned innocence. Linnell didn't move. She didn't ask them to stop. She didn't report it. She stared at the tray in front of her, still sealed, and let the coldness of the meal match the stillness inside her. She could feel the heat building behind her eyes, but she refused to blink. Crying wasn't permitted here, not now, not while eyes were watching to see if she would crack. So she didn't. She sat as though carved from the same plastic as the tray table, unmoving, unfeeling, and unseen. But she was seen. That was the point. She was being watched for a response. She understood that game too well to play it. A flight attendant approached, not Diane this time, but a younger woman, brunette, eyes wide, movements precise, probably new. She paused at Linnell's seat, looked at the untouched meal, and asked a question with the tone of someone pretending to care, but hoping not to be engaged. Linnell answered with a quiet shake of the head. The attendant nodded, reached for the tray, and stopped. She noticed the water cup still in the holder. "Still need this?" she asked, the question hanging like a test. Linnell wordlessly handed it over. The tray was removed. No apology, no words, just procedure. As the attendant turned, her shoulder brushed Linnell's arm, not hard, but not accidental. She didn't acknowledge the contact. She didn't look back. The curtain separating first class shifted again, a shadow moved behind it, and Linnell knew, without needing to see, that the man in her seat was laughing too. Perhaps not at her. Perhaps at something else. But the timing was too cruel to ignore, and the smirk she had seen earlier lived clearly in her memory now. She imagined the tablet still in his lap, her notes open, her itinerary exposed, her life in his hands as if it belonged to him. Her skin burned. Ahead of her, a child began to cry. The noise pierced the cabin, high-pitched and raw, and several passengers groaned or shifted in their seats. Linnell remained motionless. The child's mother, seated just ahead of her, struggled to soothe him, bouncing him gently, cooing softly. The boy's face was turned toward Linnell, his eyes large and wet. For a moment, their gazes locked. He blinked. She blinked. Then he fell silent, just as abruptly as he had cried. His head dropped to his mother's shoulder. The mother turned slightly and gave Linnell a look. Not gratitude, not hostility, something else. A quiet sort of blame, as if her presence had unsettled the child, as if her silence had created disquiet in the air. Linnell turned her face away. The man too rose back, laughed again. Another picture? Perhaps. Another joke. She didn't need to look. She knew how these things went. At 37 years old, she had experienced enough of them in conference rooms, in elevators, in hotel lobbies, to know when she had become the subject of mockery and the object of discomfort. You didn't need slurs when you had looks. You didn't need insults when you had sarcasm wrapped in civility. You didn't need to shout when everyone else was already listening for the wrong thing. Her seat creaked when she shifted slightly, knees sore from hours of immobility. The air was dry, her lips cracked, and still no one had offered a second drink or so much as a second glance. When the cart came around once more, it bypassed her entirely. She could have spoken up. She could have pressed the call button, summoned someone, asked for water, asked for fairness, asked for anything. But she didn't. The cost was too high, and she had already paid enough. A few rows ahead, someone coughed repeatedly, drawing attention, earning concern. Another passenger offered a throat lozenge. The silence now pressing in felt heavier than the mockery that had preceded it. Her throat felt dry, scratchy, as though she had swallowed dust, but she made no move to summon water. She had asked for nothing since the flight began and would not ask now. To ask would mean placing herself once again in the path of judgment, and the humiliation she had endured since boarding had already carved itself deep enough into her bones. Still, the need was there, small but persistent. So she glanced upward toward the dim call button, her fingers twitching with the instinct to press it, to do what any other passenger would do, without a second thought. But her hand did not rise. Her eyes lowered again, locking onto the seat back before her, blank and unmoving. It was safer to suffer silently than to invite more dismissal. Around her, others stirred in their half-sleep. One man adjusted his pillow, another woman mumbled in her dreams, but none of them looked her way. The world in 23D remained cordoned off, untouched by the communal comfort of shared humanity. The curtain ahead that separated first class from the rest of the cabin shifted once again, parting slightly before closing again, as if reminding her of the invisible barrier that divided her from what she had rightfully purchased and what had been taken. Then came the cart. It rolled slowly, humming low and constant as it moved down the narrow aisle. This time, it carried warm drinks, glasses clinking, small plates clattering together. The flight attendant guiding it, an older man with a clipped tone and stern face, stopped at each row, offering tea or coffee, sometimes both. The passenger beside her asked for peppermint tea and received it with a smile. The passenger across the aisle requested decaf and got it with 2 sugars and cream. Then the cart rolled to her row, and the attendant looked at her without recognition, without acknowledgement, his hand already moving the cart forward. Linnell opened her mouth, just barely. "Excuse me," she said, the words quiet but audible. The man paused, turned his head slightly, and looked at her with an expression that suggested inconvenience. "Do you have any hot water?" she asked. She did not request tea or coffee, did not ask for extras. Just water. Something neutral, basic, human. The attendant blinked. "We're low on supply," he said flatly. "Can't offer that right now." Then he moved on. "No apology. No explanation. No eye contact." The cart rattled past, and Linnell sat back against the seat, her lips parting slightly in disbelief, though her expression remained composed. She did not believe him. She didn't need to. She had seen the tea, the coffee, the sugar, the cream. She had heard the kettles hiss as they were poured. She knew there was hot water. She simply wasn't allowed to have it. The denial was not about scarcity. It was about message. Her presence had been challenged at the gate, her dignity stripped at the curtain, her property commandeered in plain sight. Her voice mocked 2 rows behind her, and now even the simplest request for comfort was met with silent rejection. She folded her hands again and stared at her lap. The dry ache in her throat pulsed with her heartbeat, rhythmic and sharp. From behind, the chuckle of the same 2 young men drifted forward again, softer now, but still barbed. A familiar scrape of a phone being unlocked followed. She knew what came next, and still refused to react. Even stillness, in this cabin, could be weaponized. Time passed slowly. The plane flew on. Another hour ticked by, marked by nothing but the rise and fall of soft snores and the rhythmic whir of the engines. Then a second attendant approached, this time the brunette who had taken her tray earlier. Her name tag read Kelsey. Kelsey held a tray of warm, moist towels, offering them to each passenger with gloved hands and a small, scripted smile. She moved methodically from one row to the next, gently lowering each towel onto waiting palms. When she reached Linnell's row, she paused. The passenger beside Linnell received his towel and thanked her. Kelsey gave a polite nod. Then she turned to Linnell. Her eyes scanned her face, hesitated on her scarf, lingered on her coat, and then she simply stepped past. No towel was offered. No words were exchanged. Linnell blinked once slowly. The man beside her didn't notice. The attendant continued down the aisle, her tray 2 towels lighter, as though Linnell had never existed. Linnell reached up to adjust the air nozzle above her head, but it was jammed, stuck in place, blowing frigid air directly onto her forehead. She leaned sideways, trying to angle herself away from it. The cold pressed into her skin, seeping past the barrier of her coat, stiffening her muscles. She exhaled again and held the breath before releasing it slowly. The lights dimmed further. Sleep surrounded her in waves she could not touch. The isolation grew heavier, settling into her ribs. Minutes later, Kelsey returned up the aisle, pausing at each row to collect the towels. Again, she did not stop at 23D. Again, she moved without acknowledgement. Linnell shifted slightly and caught sight of the curtain swaying ahead. A figure moved behind it. The man in 1A laughed again, a sudden sound that cut through the ambient hum. Another passenger in business class joined in. Laughter echoed once more, brief but cruel, and Linnell felt its blade twist even, without knowing its exact shape. They were laughing at something, and in that cabin, in this moment, she knew instinctively what that something was. Her exclusion, her silence, her defeat. All of it wrapped neatly into a narrative that others could mock without consequence. The hours stretched on. No one spoke to her again. No one asked if she was all right. The lights dimmed to near black. A child cried, then quieted. An older woman asked for assistance with her seatbelt. A man in front of her called for more water and received it instantly. Linnell closed her eyes not to sleep, but to create a wall between herself and the world that had, once again, decided she was unworthy of care, comfort, or even acknowledgement. Her breathing slowed, but the air still clawed at her throat. Every detail of the past hours on this flight had been tailored to reduce her from a person into a silhouette, a shadow, an unwelcome presence whose needs were ignored, whose voice was dismissed, whose rights were reallocated with clinical indifference. As the cabin remained dark and quiet, with passengers half asleep or buried in their screens and neck pillows, Linnell's mind remained active, burning with quiet fury she could not release, with sadness too heavy to shed tears. She knew if she cried now, she would be accused of being dramatic. If she spoke up, she would be seen as disruptive. So she sat in stillness, performing the act of obedience the world around her demanded, playing the role of the silent sufferer to keep the rest of the cabin comfortable in its silence. A faint rustle drew her attention. One of the attendants moved slowly down the aisle again, this time with a small basket of after-dinner treats, offering cookies and chocolates to the remaining awake passengers. Linnell watched as the basket stopped at the row in front of her. The older woman in the aisle seat picked out 2 cookies, smiled, and thanked the attendant. The basket moved to her own row, where the man beside her, who had said nothing to her all flight, chose a chocolate square and a wrapped mint. Then the attendant, whose badge read Jillian, turned slightly toward Linnell, gave her the briefest glance, then turned again and moved to the next row without a word, without hesitation. Linnell felt the impact not as a surprise, but as confirmation, another small cut in a series of invisible wounds. She stared ahead, jaw-locked, refusing to give any outward signal of hurt. The man beside her shifted slightly and crinkled the wrapper of his chocolate. He didn't look at her. He didn't offer the extra cookie in his hand. She hadn't expected him to. The overhead lights brightened slightly as the cabin prepared for its mid-flight stretch period, when some passengers used the restrooms and others stood near the rear to loosen their legs. Linnell remained seated, knowing that even the act of standing in the aisle could draw attention she didn't want. Then, just as she shifted her legs to adjust the numbness setting in her thighs, Diane returned. The same Diane who had displaced her, stripped her of her seat, erased her presence with a fabricated system error, and orchestrated the series of denials that followed. Diane walked down the aisle with a stack of damp cloths in her gloved hands. She offered them to passengers returning from the lavatory, smiling at some, engaging lightly with others. When she reached Linnell's row, she stopped briefly, as if to gauge whether Linnell would speak, but when no words came, she dropped a cloth directly onto her tray table with unnecessary force. The cloth hit the plastic surface with a dull splat, leaving a wet mark that spread toward the edge. Without a word, Diane turned and walked away. Linnell stared at the cloth, brow furrowing not because of its sudden appearance, but because of the odor, strong, pungent, something chemical and harsh like ammonia. She touched it lightly and recoiled. It was soaked through with something that was not water, not cleanser, but something acrid, something wrong. She looked toward the back galley, but Diane was already gone. A thin film of the liquid began to spread on the tray, and Linnell had to use a napkin from her coat pocket to wipe it away. No replacement towel was brought. No apology followed. Then came the true humiliation. As she adjusted her seatbelt and tried to stretch her legs, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned slowly to find Kelsey, the younger attendant, standing beside her with a narrowed gaze. "I need to check something with your bag," Kelsey said flatly. Linnell blinked. "My bag." Kelsey nodded and gestured upward. "The crew needs to inspect it. Can you open the overhead?" Linnell hesitated, but nodded. She unbuckled, stood in the cramped space, and reached up to the compartment. Her bag had not been touched since boarding. She unzipped it slowly. Kelsey leaned forward, peered inside without explanation, then pulled out a sealed envelope from the top flap. She opened it, checked the contents, then placed it back without a word and stepped away. Linnell reseated herself, stunned not by the inspection itself, but by the complete absence of rationale, of process, of decency. They had invaded her privacy in full view of other passengers, and not a single person had spoken in her defense. She noticed a man 3 rows ahead looking back over his shoulder, watching with mild interest. His gaze was not concerned. It was curious, detached. Linnell locked eyes with him for a second before he turned away. She could feel the weight of the moment press against her chest like a stone. No one asked if she was all right. No one asked if the inspection was protocol. They all simply watched it happen and then looked away. A voice crackled over the intercom. It was the co-pilot this time, giving an update on turbulence. His voice was casual, rehearsed, free of worry. But behind the words, Linnell heard the intent. Another distraction to keep the cabin unaware, unconcerned, focused on the promise of smooth skies ahead. The man in 1A had not emerged from behind the curtain, but Linnell had no doubt he remained settled in the seat she had paid for, still holding the tablet she had not been allowed to reclaim. The injustice was no longer a mistake. It had never been. It was a structure, a pattern, a script they followed with precision. Even now, as the cabin settled again into low light and passive stillness, the structure continued. Another attendant walked past Linnell's seat and paused just briefly enough to drop something into her lap. She looked down and found a paper napkin, folded, with faint smudges of ink along the crease. She opened it carefully. Inside, scribbled in rushed handwriting, were the words should have dressed like first class. No name, no signature. Just an insult delivered in a disposable wrapper, like garbage handed directly to her. Her chest rose slowly, then fell. She crumpled the napkin in one hand and slipped it into the seat pocket. The man beside her kept his eyes forward. She did not need to wonder where it came from. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it had come at all, and that whoever delivered it had felt safe enough, supported enough, to deliver it in the first place. Linnell sat back. She had not raised her voice. She had not protested. She had done nothing but board the plane and sit in her assigned seat. And yet the consequences of her mere presence had multiplied with each passing hour, reshaping the flight around her, turning comfort into punishment, turning civility into cruelty. The cabin around her, hushed under dimmed lights and soft murmurs, had long since surrendered to drowsy detachment, but her mind raced on, stung raw by the latest insult folded into a paper napkin and slipped into her lap like an offhand joke. The words, scribbled in cruel haste, still echoed behind her eyes, should have dressed like first class, each syllable a sharpened blade drawn across her dignity. It hadn't been enough for them to ignore her, displace her, deny her. Now they felt entitled to taunt her, cloaked in anonymity and cowardice, secure in the knowledge that no one would question their actions and no one would defend their target. Her throat ached with thirst, the taste of stale air clinging to her tongue, but she refused to press the call button, refused to invite another round of condescension, of suspicious glances, of whispered exchanges between flight attendants who had already labeled her a disruption for simply existing where they did not want her to be. She leaned slightly away from the aisle, adjusting her coat, shrinking herself smaller within the confines of the narrow seat, pretending for a moment that she could disappear completely. Then a soft voice intruded on her thoughts. Kelsey, the younger flight attendant with a pale complexion and carefully pinned bun, leaned down into Linnell's row, her face arranged into an expression of forced concern, the kind of performative empathy reserved for difficult passengers that might cause problems later. Kelsey's voice was even, almost sweet, but it held a practiced edge beneath the surface, as if reading from a script she had been taught in training. She asked Linnell if everything was okay, her tone slow and deliberate, her eyes scanning for signs of defiance or complaint. Linnell met her gaze without answering right away, and Kelsey, perhaps uncomfortable with the silence, glanced toward the seat pocket and asked if there had been an issue with her meal. Linnell wanted to ask whether the flight crew had planned these moments in advance, whether each round of humiliation had been coordinated like stations on a cruel relay, with one attendant passing the baton of disrespect to the next. Instead, she replied with a simple nod and said she was fine, her voice measured, her expression unreadable. Kelsey smiled too quickly, the kind of smile that vanished the second she turned her head, and then she moved on, her faux concern discarded as swiftly as it had appeared. Moments later, Linnell noticed Kelsey speaking to another passenger several rows forward, her demeanor warmer, more open, her body language relaxed in a way it never had been with Linnell. The difference was unmistakable. It wasn't just tone or words, it was presence. One was a performance, the other was real. As the aisle cleared again, Diane returned, carrying a clipboard with a folded manifest tucked beneath it. She paused beside Linnell's seat, tilting her head slightly, her lips pursed in an approximation of concern that rang even hollower than Kelsey's attempt. Diane asked if there had been a misunderstanding earlier, as if the seat reassignment had been some vague, shared confusion rather than a clear and targeted decision. Her voice was louder than it needed to be, ensuring that the surrounding passengers could hear her questions and Linnell's responses, as if to publicly frame the exchange as a resolution instead of an interrogation. Linnell, though tired and brittle inside, refused to be baited. She replied that she understood the situation and that she didn't require anything further. Diane's eyes narrowed just for a flicker of a second, before she nodded and turned away. There was no apology offered, no suggestion that her seat assignment might be restored, no acknowledgement that her belongings had been rifled through, or that an anonymous note had been delivered directly into her hands. The entire encounter was nothing more than a calculated performance, a preemptive maneuver to protect against the possibility of formal complaints, designed not to rectify harm, but to document compliance. Diane disappeared behind the curtain once again, and Linnell remained, her chest tight with restraint, her hand still. The hours passed with mechanical indifference. One by one, the cabin monitors flickered off as passengers slipped into restless sleep. A baby cried somewhere toward the rear. The air grew colder. Linnell's legs ached, but she didn't move. Another call button dinged across the aisle, and an attendant responded within seconds, offering an extra blanket to a shivering teenager. Linnell watched the exchange, saying nothing, doing nothing. She knew her place had been defined clearly and brutally, and to violate it again, even in so small a way as asking for a blanket, would invite more layers of punishment. Her worth had already been weighed and dismissed. Just past row 20, a middle-aged woman in a tan cashmere wrap sneezed several times in quick succession. Immediately, both Kelsey and Jillian descended upon her row with tissues and a small cup of water, their movements brisk and efficient, their concern evident and unforced. The woman smiled, nodded, thanked them. Her comfort was restored. Linnell closed her eyes briefly, not to sleep, but to block the image of service rendered without reluctance. The moment passed. Then came another. Diane's voice returned over the intercom, announcing that breakfast service would begin shortly, her tone chipper and impersonal. The lights lifted fractionally. Linnell blinked against the brightness, her body unready, her mind still coiled in tension. When the cart arrived again, the routine resumed. Rows ahead were offered options, omelets, fruit croissants, each passenger greeted with a friendly question and a tray placed with care. When the cart reached Linnell's row, Jillian didn't ask what she wanted. She simply placed a tray down in front of her with a paper cup of black coffee and a dry muffin wrapped in cellophane, then moved on. The muffin crumbled under her fingers as she unwrapped it, the taste as empty as the silence that followed. No water, no utensils, no napkin. She ate with her fingers, the crumbs sticking to her coat. The man beside her was given yogurt and fruit. He didn't offer to trade. He didn't speak. The indignities piled higher with every mile, each one woven into the normal flow of flight operations, indistinguishable from routine to anyone who wasn't the target. That was what made them powerful. That was what made them impossible to fight. They lived in deniability. The cart passed by again, collecting trays. Linnell gave up the remnants of her breakfast without a word. The cabin lights brightened and passengers stretched stiff limbs. Linnell Greer sat unchanged in 23D, her posture unbroken, her coat still folded across her lap, her expression unreadable after a flight that had stripped her of every expectation except silence. The past hours had layered humiliation over humiliation with surgical precision, each passive insult building upon the last, each denial of comfort an echo of the first cruel dismissal at the gate. Her body ached. Her mind simmered with rage too deep to rise to the surface, and yet she remained composed, restrained, and quiet. But now something shifted. Not in the atmosphere, not in the flight path, not even in the faces around her, but within her, a slow pivot from endurance to something sharper, something that had been waiting beneath the surface. The finality of the landing brought with it a clarity that exposure was near, that the play they had staged would soon meet an audience that mattered, one far beyond the safety of the cabin or the hierarchy of flight attendants who had orchestrated her degradation. Linnell watched as Diane emerged from behind the curtain of first class, clipboard in hand, performing her final walkthrough with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it hundreds of times. Diane's expression betrayed no memory of what she had done to Linnell, or perhaps it conveyed full awareness, polished into the kind of indifference that suggested immunity. As Diane walked past Linnell's row, her eyes didn't linger. She offered no words, no glances, no acknowledgement. Her silence was a declaration, one last seal on the experience that had unfolded from gate to tray table. Behind her came Kelsey, checking seatbelts, reminding passengers to stow away belongings and collecting stray headphones and wrappers. When Kelsey reached Linnell's row, she paused just slightly, perhaps out of obligation or maybe from a hint of unease, as if she could feel that something about the moment had changed. Linnell looked up, not with pleading or fatigue, but with quiet focus. Their eyes met. Kelsey opened her mouth to speak, then closed it, a flicker of hesitation darting across her features before she moved on, saying nothing. The landing was smooth. A ripple of applause rose from somewhere near the back of the aircraft. Linnell did not clap. She watched the blur of terminal lights pass outside the narrow window near her seat, then turned her attention forward, calculating every next movement with precision. As the plane taxied to the gate, passengers stood, reaching for bags and coats, the energy shifting to anticipation and urgency. Voices returned, light conversation sparked, the cabin buzzed with the sounds of arrival. Linnell remained seated. She had no reason to rush. She waited as the aisles filled, as the crowd pressed forward in that chaotic dance of disembarking, and she waited even as the man beside her nudged her arm while retrieving his overhead bag, still without saying a word. When her row emptied, she stood slowly, lifting her bag with quiet control, stepping into the aisle with the same deliberate grace she had carried through the terminal so many hours earlier. She moved forward, step by step, passing through rows of passengers now gathering their things, some glancing in her direction with faint curiosity, others too consumed by their own departure rituals to notice. When she reached the front of the aircraft, the curtain between economy and first class had been pulled back. The brightness of the elite cabin contrasted starkly with the narrow, dim corridor she had spent the entire flight in. In seat 1A, the man who had taken her place sat casually, chatting with Diane, who laughed at something he said, her voice too loud for the confined space, her posture too relaxed. Then the man stood, pulling a leather briefcase from a floor, and turned to exit. As he stepped into the jet bridge, Linnell approached the threshold of first class, where Diane remained, clipboard now tucked under one arm, her eyes already scanning the next section of the aircraft. Linnell stopped in front of her, not blocking the aisle, but holding still with just enough presence to command space. Diane looked up, the faintest flicker of annoyance crossing her features before her smile snapped back into place. She opened her mouth, likely preparing some automatic farewell. Linnell spoke first. Her voice was steady, soft, but unwavering. She said her name, not just her name. She followed it with the title of her position, then the agency she led, then the name of the division that had chartered the private section of this flight under a federal diplomatic agreement. She listed credentials that didn't just suggest authority, but embodied it. The man in 1A had taken her seat, but the seat wasn't merely paid for. It had been reserved by an international security agency under her name, with clearance approved and verified by both governments and commercial flight partners weeks in advance. She explained this calmly, precisely, each word a quiet hammer striking a bell. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She did not need to. Each sentence stripped away the assumptions layered over her during the flight. The assumptions that she didn't belong. The assumptions that she was mistaken. The assumptions that she could be displaced without consequence. Diane's eyes widened. Her smile collapsed. The tension in her jaw betrayed the sudden shift in her understanding. She opened her mouth, likely to explain or defend or redirect. But Linnell didn't give her the space. She simply stepped past her and handed a sealed folder into the hands of the flight marshal standing just beyond the door. The folder had her agency's insignia on the front and a memorandum inside documenting the mishandling of diplomatic credentials and the improper reassignment of federally reserved flight accommodations. The marshal accepted it without question, already aware of the situation. She had called ahead. The document had been waiting in the system. Behind her, Diane remained frozen, her mouth slightly open, her breath shallow, her clipboard trembling. She knew now that this was not a misunderstanding. It was something else entirely, something traceable, actionable, witnessed. Linnell exited the aircraft in calm, measured steps, her scarf straightened, her bag held with quiet dignity. The man from 1A stood a few paces ahead in the jet bridge, glancing back with confusion as Linnell passed him. She had informed her agency's liaison office of the incident before landing, and now the mechanisms of her position began to work in quiet synchronization. The delegation waiting in the private reception lounge included 2 officials from the Geneva Coordination Bureau, an attaché from the U.S. Embassy, and a protocol officer from the host nation. As she approached, each one greeted her not just with respect, but with a formal attentiveness given to someone whose decisions carried international weight. Behind her, the scene aboard Skylux Flight 701 began shifting rapidly. The flight marshal, who had accepted her sealed memorandum, did not simply place it in a file for later. He activated a protocol marked for immediate review, and by the time the last passengers disembarked, he had already made contact with Skylux European Operations Director. Diane, now realizing the true scope of the consequences facing her, stood stiffly in the crew area. Her previous confidence shattered by the knowledge that her name had been recorded in an official complaint being escalated through multiple channels. Kelsey hovered nearby, pale and silent, trying to remain unnoticed. Jillian had already retreated to the service galley, avoiding eye contact with her colleagues. The man from 1A stood in the jet bridge, glancing from his phone to the flight crew, trying to determine how serious this had become. He scrolled through messages, then attempted to make a call, but reception inside the corridor was weak. His voice carried no weight now. Whatever benefit he had gained from taking a seat he had not reserved was about to vanish under the scrutiny of international protocol. Back in the private reception lounge, Linnell reviewed the briefing documents prepared by her aides. While her expression remained calm, the conversations around her had already shifted to address the incident. The embassy attaché made a discreet call to notify the Department of Transportation, initiating a formal inquiry. The host nation's protocol officer, visibly unsettled by the treatment she had received, offered an apology on behalf of the receiving committee. Linnell accepted it with professional grace, but her silence between words spoke volumes. This was no longer about discomfort or service failure. It was about prejudice concealed beneath a veneer of policy, about systemic arrogance left unchecked in the vacuum of authority, about the price of invisibility forced upon those who did not conform to shallow assumptions. Meanwhile, the man from 1A was intercepted before exiting the terminal by a customs officer holding a printed image of the boarding manifest and an incident note. He was pulled aside and questioned about the tablet he had used during the flight, which bore Linnell's initials on the back cover. He stammered through an explanation, claiming it had been handed to him by mistake, that he had no idea whose it was, but the officer noted that the device contained files with federal encryption tags. Within minutes, the device was confiscated, and he was advised to remain available for further questioning. His face, which had earlier brimmed with smug superiority, now reflected uncertainty and shallow panic. The brief authority he thought he held had turned to quicksand underfoot. On board the aircraft, Diane was pulled aside by the lead steward, who had just arrived to debrief the returning crew. The lead steward had reviewed the early reports and security recordings, and was already compiling documentation for disciplinary action. Diane attempted to explain the reassignment as a last-minute system error, but the logs showed no such change. The flight system had recorded Linnell Greer in 1A until the final override performed manually by Diane herself. That override, tagged with her crew ID, had reassigned a seat to an unlisted standby name flagged later for a regular upgrade. Kelsey was questioned next. She stumbled through a vague explanation about following orders and not knowing the full context, but her recorded exchanges with Linnell, including the denial of service and the inspection of Linnell's personal items without cause, had been flagged as policy violations. Her file would be reviewed by the airline's Human Resources Compliance Board. As Linnell's transportation departed the airport in a black diplomatic SUV, her presence already logged with the host country's protocol team, the reverberations of her earlier silence continued to spread. The airline's regional director received a notification from legal counsel within the hour, alerting him to the incoming complaint and the potential impact on government contracts. Skylux had been negotiating a 3-year extension on their federal transport agreement for classified international missions, a contract valued at nearly $3 billion. Linnell's report, now officially logged and supported by an attached diplomatic memo, placed that negotiation in jeopardy. In the upper floors of the airline's main office, executive meetings were called urgently. Names were circulated. A review of employee records was initiated. Within 24 hours, an official statement of regret was drafted for release, though Linnell herself had made no media statement. She had no interest in spectacle. Her message had already been delivered, and it carried more weight than any public confrontation. She had revealed the truth not with anger, but with precision, not with complaint, but with credentials, not with retaliation, but with accountability. By evening, Diane received notification that she had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Her crew pass was suspended, her flight privileges revoked. A disciplinary hearing was scheduled within the week. Kelsey was reassigned to ground duties. Jillian submitted a leave request the next morning. The man from 1A returned to his hotel under a shadow of internal inquiry, having been flagged by the embassy liaison for potential misconduct in the handling of restricted digital material. And Linnell, now in the calm of her secure hotel suite, finally removed her coat, placed her bag on the desk, and sat in the quiet. She allowed herself a single moment of stillness without vigilance. No call buttons to press. Skylux's executive legal counsel sat in the corner, stone-faced, reviewing the files from diplomatic authorities that described the seat reassignment not as a simple error, but as a willful override that displaced a credentialed federal official from a seat tied to a classified transport protocol. The words negligence and discrimination appeared in bold in the preliminary findings, with attached testimonies detailing the cascade of policy violations that followed. Diane tried to explain once more that she had acted on instinct, that she had simply followed procedures under pressure, that the request to move the man into 1A had come through as a late upgrade. But the evidence laid bare a different story. Her system logs showed no documented reason for the reassignment. Her override was manual, not automated. Her report filed post-flight failed to mention the diplomatic tag tied to the original seat reservation. Her tone throughout the cabin recordings was detached, dismissive, and on several occasions, overtly cold when addressing the passenger she later learned was not just a traveler, but a top-tier security official with clearance, known across multiple branches of government. Kelsey, seated just outside the room, waiting for her turn to face the panel, knew what awaited her. She had been interviewed twice since landing. Once by airline HR and once by an external compliance representative who had asked detailed questions about the towel incident, the denied beverage request, and the intrusive handling of Linnell's carry-on. She had no reasonable defense. Her attempts to blame training protocol fell apart when surveillance footage revealed her offering warm towels and refreshments to passengers sitting one row away from Linnell. The review board had already prepared a recommendation for probation, and legal advisors were still weighing whether her conduct merited termination or remedial reassignment. Jillian, sensing the weight of the fallout, had already submitted her resignation, citing personal stress and family matters, a convenient escape from the scrutiny that would have followed if she had remained. None of them had expected the woman in 23D to be anyone of consequence. None of them had paused long enough to consider that professionalism meant consistency, not selective care. None of them had understood that their actions, quiet and seemingly justifiable in the moment, would carry weight beyond the narrow aisles of a night flight. Now they understood. The man who had taken Linnell's seat faced his own reckoning. Identified as an independent contractor connected to a firm bidding for a federal contract, he had assumed the upgraded seat was a last-minute accommodation. When questioned about how he accessed Linnell's tablet, he claimed confusion, believing it to be a device provided by the airline. That explanation collapsed when security logs traced his use of the device to sensitive application files tied to the very contract his company had been pursuing. Now under federal review for unauthorized access of restricted material, his travel privileges had been suspended, and his employer received formal notice that his presence on any further government-linked flights would require pre-clearance and direct approval from the Oversight Committee. His reputation, once polished by association and charm, had become a liability. Meanwhile, within Skylux's executive circle, panic had set in. The contract in jeopardy, valued at $2.9 billion over 3 years, had moved into critical reassessment by the Federal Review Board. Linnell's report, supported by affidavits and an attached security protocol breach memo, outlined systemic issues ranging from crew insensitivity to failure to safeguard protected materials. The report did not embellish. It simply recounted, but the facts alone were enough. Executives scrambled to distance themselves from the frontline employees, issuing internal notices about updated sensitivity training and pledging policy reforms. They issued a formal letter of apology to Linnell, delivered not by email, but by hand through an agency liaison. It was printed on heavy paper, embossed with the company seal, and signed by 3 senior officers. Linnell read it once, then placed it in a folder and said nothing. The agency she led had no need for public retaliation. Their mission thrived in silence, but they never forgot. And while retaliation was beneath her office, consequences were not. Contracts were reviewed. Alternative carriers were considered. Meetings were scheduled. Elsewhere, news of the incident leaked to a niche diplomatic journal, which published a quiet exposé on the risks of arrogance among private travel contractors. No names were mentioned, but the implications were clear. Within 2 weeks, Skylux stock dipped 3%, and internal morale plummeted as new flight protocols were rushed into place. Back at the crew headquarters, Diane gathered her belongings from her locker under the watchful eye of a supervisor. Her uniform, folded neatly, was placed in a return bin, her badge deactivated. As she stepped into the parking lot with a cardboard box in her arms, the reality of what had unraveled settled in. She had once believed that her experience made her untouchable, that small acts of exclusion would never matter if done subtly enough. But now she saw that the cost of casual cruelty, when directed at someone who carried truth like a sword, could not be hidden. Kelsey received a notice assigning her to 6 weeks of ground training with mandatory evaluations. She opened the email in silence, then closed her laptop and stared at the wall, uncertain whether she would return. Diane sat in the back corner of a community development seminar, her notepad untouched, her eyes locked on the presenter speaking about the intersection of public service and personal bias. It had been 6 months since she lost her position with Skylux, 6 months since her name had vanished from the crew logs and been quietly passed between hiring managers as a cautionary tale. She had spent those months buried in silence, first consumed by shame, then denial, and finally something unfamiliar: understanding. The shame had been instinctive, a reaction to public exposure and private guilt, but the denial had lingered longer, convincing her that the punishment had outweighed the crime. Only when she began volunteering at a local shelter, sorting donations and assisting families displaced by evictions, did she begin to see what had truly unraveled on that flight. She began to see that what she had considered professionalism had often been thinly veiled control, that her comfort with authority had blurred her empathy, that her split-second judgments had not been harmless protocol, but expressions of deeper prejudice she had never acknowledged. She watched now, as the speaker recounted a story about a diplomat wrongfully targeted during routine travel, not naming names, not pointing fingers, but echoing the events of that flight with uncanny precision. Diane lowered her gaze, the image of Linnell Greer sitting in 23D vivid in her memory, unmoving, dignified, suffering in silence, while Diane had convinced herself she was only doing her job. Kelsey, who now worked part-time at a nonprofit education center, sat 2 rows ahead, taking notes with an intensity that suggested a desperate need to learn, to grow, to rebuild something inside herself. They hadn't spoken since their hearings, but the silence between them no longer felt like avoidance. It felt like penance. Kelsey had enrolled in a program on inclusive service, paid for out of her own pocket, not to earn forgiveness, but to earn understanding. She had stayed late at the education center, helping kids who reminded her of all the passengers she had once overlooked, all the lives she had passed by without seeing. The man from 1A had disappeared from the public contract scene, his company passing over him for client-facing roles. Months later, he resurfaced in a letter published anonymously in an internal business forum, reflecting on arrogance, entitlement, and the blindness of assuming value through access. His words admitted no names, but carried the weight of someone who had finally recognized the damage caused by careless privilege. Back in Washington, Linnell walked through the marble halls of her agency, files in one hand, her security badge clipped to her coat, her posture unchanged, her presence grounded. The incident had not defined her, but it had reshaped the system around her. New guidelines were issued for federal partners traveling through civilian routes, including protections against targeted seating reassignments, elevated oversight protocols, and agency-backed reporting channels. Not because she had demanded them, but because the truth she carried forced reflection from those who had previously preferred comfort over confrontation. She received no media spotlight. She gave no interviews. Her work remained focused, quiet, deliberate. But her story traveled without her voice, told in meetings, echoed in policy memos, discussed in classrooms where future flight crews learned that dignity denied becomes justice delayed, but never lost. Diane, after the seminar, lingered near the exit, watching the room empty slowly. She stepped forward and approached the speaker, not with an introduction, but with a question. She asked how people changed when change didn't save their jobs, but saved their understanding. The speaker answered that redemption didn't require applause, only effort, only truth, only the willingness to see others not as passengers or problems, but as people. Diane nodded slowly and walked out into the afternoon light. She had begun applying for positions not in airlines, but in training centers, programs designed to retrain service professionals in empathy and equity. She didn't expect to erase what she had done, but she no longer wanted to. She wanted to carry it with her, as proof that awakening was possible even after failure. Kelsey would join her in time. They would not become heroes. They would not become friends. But they would become different. Because of one woman in 23D. Because of silence that roared louder than protest. Because the truth, once revealed, could not be unheard. Linnell continued her mission. Each time she traveled, she carried herself with the same quiet strength. Some flight crews greeted her with recognition now, not because of status, but because of respect earned in silence. Not all who saw her knew the story. Not all needed to. The ones who mattered had learned what it meant to see, truly see, another human being. And that was enough.